Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola, and welcome to the Unauthorized Disclosure Weekly Podcast. We have an excellent interview for you. But before I move on and introduce the guest who we have for this week's show, please take a moment to go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, become a supporter. If you like and appreciate the guests that you're seeing, I do the best that I can to find people who don't normally appear on all the major podcasts. I try to introduce you to new voices who are worth following, but also sometimes bring on some familiar faces. So sign up here, patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. Also, if you would prefer the Dissenter newsletter, if you go to the dissenter.org and subscribe at the podcast level, the dissenter.org, and subscribe at the podcast level, there's a way to support only the podcast for a few bucks and keep this going. Without the group of people I have who listen and help fund this regularly, it would not be possible to keep up this show. So I also thank those people who are out there. And those people every month get exclusive content. There are episodes with one of the founders of this show, Rania Kalik, who does monthly episodes. She's been in Venezuela this past month. So that's the subject of this week's show. But I'm looking forward to sitting down and talking to her about her time in Venezuela and what she saw after the election and the election aftermath. And that episode will be exclusively available for people who are subscribed to Unauthorized Disclosure. So before we recorded this interview, the U.S. government, particularly through Secretary of State Antony Blinken, had not come out to say that the U.S. recognized Edmundo González as the winner of the election. It had just said that they wanted to see detailed tallies from the election. So that's the conversation would be slightly different if we had this news. We now have next generation Juan Guaidó. I mean, this is what, yeah. So that's the candidate that is they're now going to claim as the president of Venezuela. Of course, we know how well that went for the United States the last time they did this. So in all seriousness, I have this interview for you as we break down the issues around the U.S. and the way in which the United States and then a small coalition of countries in Latin America seek to undermine the ability of the Venezuelan people to elect and reelect somebody like Nicolas Maduro because of the threat that this project represents to corporations throughout the world, as well as the US government's agenda. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to this interview. I'm very pleased to be joined by Cira Pascual Marquina, who is a member of the editorial team for Venezuela Analysis. She is based in Caracas. The team has been on the ground covering updates after the Venezuela presidential election. Nicolas Maduro was reelected. And then we've seen the response of the right-wing opposition to Maduro's reelection. And Cira is here to discuss what's been unfolding in Venezuela this past week. So welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me here. And it is important to be thinking and learning about what's going on in Venezuela, not only in this conjuncture, but also because the Venezuelan people are reorganizing society as we speak.
Well, let's begin there. In the positive, What if rather than letting the opposition define our conversation, we'll come back to them obviously because this is a problem. This is something that people who are building a better society in Venezuela have to deal with consistently. But can you speak to Nicolas Maduro ran for re-election? A majority elected him. We'll get to the United States government's response and some of the coalition that is aligned with the US in the region, how they responded to Venezuela. But first, what was at stake here? What were people coming out to vote for when they reelected Maduro?
Well, the Bolivarian revolution, the Bolivarian process is about 25 years old. We will not go in depth, but I think it is good. It is actually very good, Kevin, to begin with a little bit of a context. The Bolivarian process is a process that proposes to profoundly democratize society. So I would like to highlight first that elections, presidential elections, elections to the parliament are important, and they happen in the mode that they happen in most countries, except generally with more options than in global north countries. But Venezuela's democracy is not limited to what has come to be known as representative democracy, or what we would also call what some would call in the global north liberal democracy. Venezuela's democracy, in the sense that since the early days of the process, Hugo Chavez and the people of Venezuela committed themselves to a participative and protagonic democracy. In other words, yes, people go to vote, Venezuelans go to vote for their president, for instance, every 6 years. The presidential term is 6 years. Or for the National Assembly, which is our parliament, every 4 years. Or for all the other instances that, like are common to, we could say, to the structures of a bourgeois state. But also, in addition to that, Venezuela has another layer of democracy, which is participative, which is assembly-based, which is direct democracy. And that expresses itself mostly, but not exclusively, in the communal councils and especially the communes, with the communes being both the pathway and the end goal of socialism, as has been built here in Venezuela. So the communes are still in the making, but they express another kind of democracy, a democracy that is more substantive, we could say, a democracy which is beyond, like you choosing your representative every 2, 4, or 6 years. So that would be kind of like the larger context in relation to Venezuela's project and its democracy.
Thank you for that explanation. So as there have been some videos that have been coming out, and then there have also been some viral videos that are not even depicting or showing what is happening in Venezuela that have led people to believe things that are false about the response of the Venezuela government. But you don't have to get into those. Let's focus on what you have observed reporting in Caracas. What has taken place over the last few days as the opposition refuses to accept the result?
Well, on the 28th, the presidential elections were held. Venezuela's voting system is a voting system that is actually kind of like very well constructed. The electoral system is actually electronic, but then it has a paper trail and it has many processes and many moments of review. So this is kind of like the first thing. On Sunday, people went to the polls. A high number of people voted, 59% of those who were registered voted. And the results, which were emitted by the National Electoral Council on the very, very early hours of the 29th of Monday in the AM, they yelled it, well, that Nicolas Maduro had won, and that the multiple opposition candidates. The one who was most voted was Edmundo González, who he had 44%. He is the proxy of Maria Corina Machado. Maria Corina Machado being very well known because she is kind of like beloved by imperialism and by US interests. She is a fascist. She actually called people to go to the streets and promote violent protests in 2014 and 2017. And also, he has promoted the US sanctions. She has called for sanctions, and she has also called for US military intervention. So that kind of gives you the picture of the person. She, for those reasons, and as I think it would be the case in any country, when a politician calls for foreign intervention, she is not able to run. She wasn't able to run. She is not able to hold public office. So her proxy was Edmundo González, a rather old and uncharismatic person. She was the one who actually was on the campaign trail. So that gives you a little bit of the context. Now, what happened on Sunday and on Monday, basically, when the National Electoral Council gave the results immediately after, but even before, they had already been saying, the opposition, this bloc, this far-right opposition, I would say fascist opposition and pro-imperialist opposition bloc, they said that they had won, basically. They called fraud. Of course, this was not anything new for us, because as we were saying before we got started, Kevin, we are very used to it. In every single election in Venezuela, especially elections that are at the national level, the opposition and its partners in the global north, or its bosses, I would rather say, in the global north, say that our elections are not free and fair elections, something that they want to come back later. But so as I'm telling you the story, not only were we unsurprised that they said that they had won and that they had been fraud, because they have been doing it over years, year after year, but also as we were leading up to these elections, the mainstream media internationally was saying that, like the lead of Edmundo González, of the opposition leader, was by 20, 30 points. I mean, things that just had absolutely no base. What does this mean? Like, of course, there were a high number, millions of people who voted for the opposition. These people had been told that they were going to win, and beforehand, and afterwards, after the National Electoral Congress released the first bulletin, they were told by their leaders of the opposition that there had been fraud. As you might expect, this generates a lot of tension. Monday was a very, very, frankly, scary and difficult day for us in Venezuela. I was in the morning, everything was very empty. It was like a day after the elections in Venezuela. It's generally slow, etc. There had been some confrontations at night. There had been some barricades or guarimbas put through by opposition, by groups of the opposition. But on Monday, things seemed pretty early. Things seemed pretty relaxed. So I went out, and by the afternoon, when I had to come back, well, we had to go through barricades. It took us, what generally would have taken us in terms of coming back home, about, I don't know, 15 minutes. It took more than 2 hours to come back. The city was really in a very, very difficult situation. This is what I lived. This is what many people lived. The day before, there had been, by the way, I should mention, a massive march to Miraflores after the victory was released by the National Council. There had been a massive march in support of Maduro, as usually happens after a victory in any country. There are generally concentrations to celebrate the victory. So that's Sunday, or actually very early hours of Monday in the afternoon, in the evening. We begin to see a lot of violence in the street. And then I'm talking about violence where people have been wounded, hundreds of people have been hurt, and where there have been stormings of PSUV, that being the Socialist Party, the party of Nicolas Maduro, storming of houses of the PSUV. Actually, there's been Also, other instances of violence, specific, particular Chavista grassroots people have been threatened, and the story goes on and on and on. So there were those expressions which were violent expressions, and there were also what are not only in Venezuela but also Latin American expressions of, we could say, civil protest. People who also thought that they had won, haciendo cacerolazo, when you go with the pans, pots and pans on your window, and you go blah blah blah. Makes quite a racket. With 3 or 4, you can make an enormous racket. But there were a number, and we should recognize the people who were, like, if you do that, it's because you are not in agreement with what has happened. So there are a number of people, a significant amount of people of the opposition, who have come to believe that they won. Most of them, of course, are not violent, but they are unhappy about the situation. So that was Monday, and then Tuesday there was a massive, massive, massive march to Miraflores, to the presidential palace, and I will stop soon because I'm talking too much. But that was so beautiful, like from the barrios. It actually reminded us of the counter coup in 2002. Of course, there was no coup this time. I think they would have done a coup if they had been able to, the right wing. I have no doubt. There was no coup, but there was kind of like the context of a coup cooking up on Monday. So on Tuesday, thousands and thousands of people poured into Miraflores, into the presidential palace from the barrios. It reminded us of the 13th of April 2002, when again people went to Miraflores to defend their democracy. It was beautiful. Venezuelans are really, like Venezuelan, there are particularities about every people, and Venezuelans are very joyful people. So while people were very concerned about what was going on Tuesday, people were also happy because, of course, the Bolivarian process had won. So there was a combination of concern, but also celebration on this massive march. And since then, and until Saturday, there are going to be daily marches to Miraflores in support of the democratically elected President Nicolas Maduro.
And it would seem rather essential that these marches take place so that there isn't a vacuum or a space for that opposition to fill and manipulate the global public, and also to feed into U.S. imperialism. And I think before I want to play specifically what the U.S. has said about this democratic election. But before we get to that, it seems what's always missing is any attention to the violence and the coup attempts that have been repeated on the part of these factions, on the part of these groups for the last 20 plus years, maybe closer to 30. And so, I'm aware that there was a 2019 coup attempt, right? There's the puppet of Juan Guaidó, who the U.S. has picked. There was an even more amateur kind of effort with fishing boats in 2020.
Operación Gedeón, yeah.
Yep. There was the drone explosives that were sent, it seems to, at the very least, to injure Maduro. I don't know if there was a chance that there could be a deadly incident where he was left killed, but I suppose that was possible. But somebody was targeting. I'm sure those people have. I know there was an investigation. But this violence that unfolds, that, and then along with these garimbas that you're talking about, that should stun anybody who follows events in Venezuela. The fact that people set up these barricades that are, as I understand it, they're basically on fire and things are smoldering, and
Basically,
it's very
people,
dangerous. It's very dangerous, right, to be around these
yeah.
locations.
So basically, people put tires and trash and burn them, and they are oftentimes armed, so they are very, very dangerous. So yeah. So I mean, basically, about this situation of violence is nothing new. Um, Venezuela is a global south country, and violence is always more overtly expressed in global south countries. Of course, the relation between the capitalist center and the periphery, and the means of exploitation and extraction of goods and wealth from our global south countries comes necessarily with violence. So violence is it's a quotidian, uh, it's quotidian, not only in Venezuela, but in general in the global south. And it's quotidian, not because people of the global south are particularly violent, which we aren't, but because US imperialism and global north capital exercise quotidian violence on our lives. So, but it is true that Venezuela has lived particularly violent situations as an outcome of the fascist tendencies that are against the will of the Venezuelan people to build a sovereign project, a sovereign, and not only sovereign, but also a socialist project. So then on top of that, you have to add something that we haven't talked about, which is sanctions, which is of course also extremely violent. I mean, sanctions are war by other means, no doubt. The numbers of people who have died because of the US sanctions on Venezuela are in the tens of thousands, maybe even more. Millions of people have left Venezuela, and anybody who is concerned about Venezuelan migrants should first and foremost in the US write to the US representative, the congressman or the representative, to stop the blockade on Venezuela, which is really, truly bloody. So there are many factors many expressions of violence that we are living here right now. I mean, recently, fortunately, for the last 24 hours, the expressions of overt violence in the street have been very limited. Nonetheless, violence has been part of the Venezuelan political landscape, not because of the Bolivarian Revolution, but because of the attempts to counter the Bolivarian Revolution. And I think that's important to highlight this. Chavez always said, la revolución bolivariana es pacífica pero armada. It's pacific but armed. So yes, pacific, but also prepared to defend itself. So we are not willing to be, Venezuelan people are not willing to go through what Allende went through in Chile.
And that's all important to emphasize. So let me play what one of the spokespeople for the U.S. State Department had to say, and then just you know all of this already, but just get your response to the way the U.S. is going about delegitimizing the election on a global stage.
First, we applaud the Venezuelan people for their participation in the presidential election, and we commend their courageous and commitment to democracy in the face of repression and adversity. We've seen the announcement from overnight by the Venezuelan electoral representatives, and we have serious concerns that this result does not reflect the will and the votes of the Venezuelan people. And it's critical that every vote is counted fairly and transparently, and that election officials immediately share information with the opposition and independent observers without delay, and that electoral representatives publish the detailed tabulation of votes. That's what the United States is watching for. It's what the international community is watching for, and will respond accordingly. I'm not going to speculate on any particular action that might take place in Venezuela. I will also just note that this is something that, as I said, countries around the world are watching very closely to. I believe within the hour before I came down, you saw a number of 7 or 8 countries across Latin America also express serious concern and wanting to see these published detailed tabulation of votes. So that's something that we'll continue to focus on.
So
Go ahead, but I just want to point out as you go into it that a lot of what the US says is vague without specifics, and it's hard to engage, I would imagine, if you represent Venezuela, because you don't actually know what they're claiming about the, you know, obviously it's made up, it's false, but they're saying, generally speaking, it's corrupt without giving any specific evidence.
Well, they are talking about the tallies, but and we'll go into that because it's good that people understand kind of like the whole context. Not, there's been also declarations, public declarations by none less than Anthony Blinken, like the one who's overtly, like all of them, supporting the genocide in Gaza. Blinken
Exactly.
expressed serious concern about the elections, and again, none of these surprises us. Now, it should be understood, however, that the National Electoral Instance, the Council, gave its first bulletin on the very early hours of Monday. Sorry. And after that, there's supposed to be a second bulletin that hasn't still happened, but that's it's taking a little bit longer to release the second bulletin, and it relates to the tallies. Generally after an election, every polling center, you will be able to know how your polling center went by going to the National Electoral Congress website. So indeed, there has not been this release of these tallies yet, and the question is why. Basically, and this should be really no surprise for anybody, the authorities claim that there was an attack on the system, an attack on Sunday and basically Monday on the system. And there's been attacks on so many instances. There's actually been prior attacks on the National Electoral Congress, and there's been so many attacks in Venezuela, so this should be no surprise for anybody. The biggest ongoing attack, being the sanctions. So basically, as we wait for the second bulletin, which will eventually come, this has actually generated kind of like, in Spanish we say un caldo de cultivo, like it's brewing, like this is where they found their brew to question the elections. And actually yesterday, Nicolas Maduro went to the Supreme Court, Venezuela's Supreme Court, which is an option that you have to make sure that the Supreme Court kind of like follows up on the situation. And declares the final victor, the Supreme Court, of course, being the highest court in Venezuela. So there's that going, that is in process, and this is what these folks are referring to. Now, indeed, there are Latin American countries that are expressing their concern. Nothing new. Milei, as you might imagine, from Argentina, the fascist, Bolsonaro, the right-wing leader, and other countries from Latin America, all of them on the right, and all of them aligned with the United States, have expressed their concerns. Peru, Panama, República Dominicana, Argentina, and Costa Rica. Now, it's important to say this because also there was a response from the Venezuelan government. The Venezuelan government broke relations with all these countries, but that's not all the countries of Latin America or of the world. And interestingly, yesterday there was an OAS meeting in Washington, D.C. This is actually very interesting because I would like to look in my notes on the data on that. Basically, this was a session in Washington, D.C., in the OAS, that was set in place to make a statement expressing collective concern for Venezuela's electoral process. Of course, the OAS is kind of like an extension of U.S. interest. So, of the Latin American countries, they were not able to hold this meeting because 11 abstained. They would not able to do a resolution and hold a final. because 11 abstained, 4 didn't show up. So most of the countries, let's say, there wasn't a consensus, or there wasn't even a majority, not even, there wasn't a majority rather, to promote this document, this declaration against Venezuela, against Venezuela's electoral process. So this is interesting because even this instance, which is super U.S. interest aligned, was not able to do what the U.S. wants them to do. It's not going to be easy. Of course, Venezuela is projecting a sovereign project. Venezuela took hold of its oil resources in 2001, 2002. Venezuela has a different kind of democracy that's aligned with the interests of the people and not with the interests of the bourgeoisie, or at least it tries to. I mean, of course, we should not imagine that everything here is perfect. You know, like the horizon is a horizon where there's a new democracy, with a horizon with socialism and a sovereign horizon. Again, I would like to emphasize there are problems in Venezuela, but those problems are for Venezuelans to solve them. And the problem that the United States has with Venezuela is those three things, I would say: sovereignty, including sovereignty over its resources, proposing a new kind of democracy that's not tied to the interest of the bourgeoisie and of the imperialists, and three, that this is a project that assumes itself socialist, and that has actually a pathway, that has defined a pathway for going towards socialism, which are the communes.
Thank you for that. Yeah, you're up against, Venezuelans are up against the Elon Musks who just come out there and say, we will coup anybody that we want and steal your resources and come for whatever your people can give us. It could be labor. It could be cheap labor, I imagine. So we're winding down our conversations, but I do have a couple things that I would like to ask you from my position here in the United States. And so, you mentioned sanctions earlier. There was this exchange, and I'm also going to play this a longer. I want to include a journalist who is from Gaza or is a Palestinian and has been doing some tremendous work questioning, challenging the genocide denial of the U.S., but actually got in a good statement / question about Venezuela's sanctions to the State Department this past week. And then get your response about where you think, so where this is going is it's a question of, will there be more sanctions on Venezuela? And I'd like you to address that issue after this clip.
Look, Venezuela has been under severe sanctions since 2019. They can't feed their people. They cannot fix the oil facilities. They cannot export and so on. Is that a sound policy? I mean, they tried to impose, the U.S. tried to help in imposing another president and so on, Guaidó and all that stuff. And how long will these sanctions go on? I mean, is generally speaking, are sanctions a good policy? I mean, one third of the world today is under American sanctions.
The foreign policy decisions that this administration will take, especially as it relates to Venezuela, they are going to be assessed based on the actions that Maduro and his representatives take, as well as our relationship with any other country as well. That's how we assess the foreign policy tools that are at our disposal. Shannon.
So on sanctions, the Biden administration has actually eased some of the oil industry restrictions in the past couple months as they've tried to move Venezuela towards holding an election. Now, officials have also said that reimposing some of those restrictions on energy companies is not something that's under consideration. Is there a reason that it's not under consideration?
So I'm just not going to get into the deliberative process. What I can say is that as it relates to Venezuela and the Maduro regime, we will continue to promote accountability for Maduro and his representatives, so as long as they continue repressing Venezuelans. And whatever actions the United States may or may not take, we will assess our sanctions policy towards Venezuela, again, based on the actions that Mr. Maduro and his representatives take, and that's what it'll be rooted on. But I'm not going to get into the process beyond that.
I mean, we've talked a little bit about sanctions. I'm part of Venezuela Analysis, and we recently put out a book that's called A War Without Bombs. I encourage everybody who wants to learn a little bit more about the impact, the social, political, and impact of sanctions to turn to this book. Sanctions, by the way, are illegal when they are not multilateral. In other words, when they are not ratified by the UN. So what the US is doing is illegal. But talking about this particular conjuncture, so indeed, as one of the journalists was asking, there's been an easing of the sanctions on the oil context over the past few months. I really don't think it's because they wanted to encourage free and fair elections, but because actually there is a very a war situation, a US-led war situation in the Middle East. So I think that's my reading. That's why there's been an easing of the sanctions. For that reason, our hope is that they will not reactivate some of the sanctions that they had eased, but really don't know. And there are still more than 900 sanctions going on against Venezuela, and the impact of the sanctions is tremendous. Look, some people have asked me, are these free and fair elections, the elections in Venezuela? And I'll say no, basically because the things are really stacked against the sovereign project. When a country is under siege, when a country is facing really brutal blockade, blockade for about 9 years, but before that, a lot of actions from the U.S. in different sorts, like support of coups, etc., economic wars against the Venezuelan people. So for the past 25 years, Venezuela has been under siege. In those conditions, if somebody asked me if these elections on Sunday were free and fair, I would say no, because things are stacked against the side that aligns itself with the Bolivarian process, that being with President Nicolas Maduro, the Pacific parties, and the patriotic pole. I think it's important to say that because, like all of a sudden, like all the liberals, progressives, and liberals of the world are concerned about. I'm not saying you because you're on the left, but like all these well-thinking people of the world are concerned about our elections. But man, I mean, the suffering of the Venezuelan people, the impact of the sanctions of the Venezuelan people has been tremendous. And that's why when they ask me if we have had free and fair elections, I will say no. However, in that context, Nicolas Maduro won. Nicolas Maduro is won, and he won with in an unlevel playing field that's stacked against him and against the Bolivarian process.
And then this is extra. I feel like we hit most of the main issues that you would want to have addressed in a conversation about the Venezuela election. And if that's not true, feel free to, volunteer any details that might be missed. But on a very specific issue that is of concern to, I'd say, Western countries that hold themselves out as democracies, I wanted to ask you before finally concluding about election observers. The idea people come to this is like a standard for global South countries, right? These usually like European people or US from the US, these Western individuals, they come and they observe. There are actually colleagues of mine who I think you could say either by playing a role as a journalist or being there to see the process unfold themselves, were trying to bear witness and then go to people and say, they're within the context that you just described, there was a free and fair election. But something that people have placed a lot of importance on especially the political establishment, is the Carter Center and what they say about Venezuela. I think, when I think about the Carter Center as an example, I remember that at one point, I think it was after Hugo Chavez had been elected, that they had actually recognized that there were democratic processes that were being utilized, but now it seems to be a much different organization, and they are helping the U.S. They put out a statement finally on the 30th, and I just, before we go, would like your response to what is being said here when they're claiming that there's an environment of restricted freedoms for political actors, civil society organizations, and the media. They're claiming that there was a clear bias in favor of the incumbent. They're suggesting that voter registration that there's too short of deadlines, few places to register, minimal public information, and also they seem to suggest that those who have chosen to be exiles or who have fled, possibly because of sanctions, that they have limited ability to participate in the election, and then they also, I think, are touching upon the issue that you raised earlier, which is that Machado can't run. She has engaged in acts that disqualify her. So there's a proxy that ran in her place. They seem to object to that disqualification. So your response before we end the conversation here.
So I will pick up on a few of the things, maybe not on all of them.
No, it's okay. I threw a lot at you.
No, it's actually important to hear what these folks have to say. I mean, I think that basically the U.S., I actually would have to go back to Chavez's death to I think that when Chavez dies, U.S. imperialism, the interests of the interests of global North capital, saw a chance to bring down the Bolivarian process. And while there had been many and very violent attacks against the process, including the 2002 coup, which is not nothing. I mean, it was an actual coup that succeeded for 48 hours, a little bit under 48 hours. But after Chavez's death, basically, the U.S. has begun to orchestrate a more intensified attack against the Bolivarian process, including its the liberal democratic aspects of the process. So it shouldn't be too surprising to us. I'd like to pick up on a few of the issues that you raised. The thing with Maria Corina Machado, that one, we already explained it. I mean, she called for U.S. intervention. She called for violent street protests that actually led to more than 100 people dying. I think that in most countries, somebody of that profile would not be allowed to run. In terms of the media, I don't know. I really saw a bias in the other direction. I saw a bias in the other direction because when you talk about media, I imagine we have to think about social media and all sorts of media nowadays. I imagine that we are not just thinking about television. So I actually saw a very definite bias in the other direction. And registration, they're actually, the CNE sets up, the National Electoral Council sets up the rules for registration, and basically they were aligned with the standards set up by the electoral law, Venezuela's electoral law. So unless they want to meddle into our laws as well, there was no problem with that. Yes, there are many people abroad who were not able to vote, and mostly because, many of them have been made to flee in the worst conditions from Venezuela. As you know, well, many of them are in the U.S. of recently. They are in very difficult situations, and they are not recognized by the US, so it's difficult to kind of like activate their capacity to vote. But it's true that not all the polling centers internationally were open. I think that the ones that were more, they are prone to be violently attacked. Consulates are prone to be violently attacked in electoral context. So some of them indeed did not open. But actually the number of people who are registered in these consulados is minimal compared to the possibly 4 to 6 million Venezuelans who are living abroad. I mean, we are talking about tens of thousands of people who are actually registered to vote abroad. Versus millions of people who are outside of the country. Why? Because of the economic situation that's been imposed on this country due to the US sanctions. Of course, we could also do a self-critic. I mean, of course, there have to be problems within Venezuela, and maybe some of the situations that we face also we could do self-critic. But again, that's for us to go through that. I mean, it's not for the US to decide that. So that's with the Carter Center. But I'd like to say that indeed there were 900 observers, international observers, but more important than that, actually, because international observers love to talk about themselves. More important than that is that every polling station, every party has the right to have an observer in each polling station. And that should be highlighted. Like the polling stations, that the closest polling station where I was, there were observers from, I think 15, there's 30 some parties. There were observers from 15 parties, and more than half of them were opposition observers. So the observers, we should highlight that there's a system by which all parties are able to observe the process. It's interesting, and I will probably finish that there because perhaps we're going on too long, but it's interesting that on the night of the 28th, on the night of the presidential elections, while there were observers in many of these centers, I mean, in as many centers as each party wants to have their observer, they can have it, and they will be the CNE, the National Electoral Council, will ratify them as observers and so on. But in many polling centers, there were violent stormings of the polling centers. Why? I mean, obviously to generate violence and to generate distress, but they actually already have their representatives, their observers inside. So it was basically kind of like the objective of destabilizing the whole electoral process, I would think.
All right. And then I'll just say, as we conclude, and then if you have any final comment, I invite you to say anything, because I had you talk about a particular issue there. Maybe you want to say something about the democratic process, and how great it is that Venezuelans continue to struggle and persevere through all of this. But I do just wanted to give the counter here from one of my colleagues, Vijay Prashad, who I know was in Venezuela, and just said of the Carter Center that it was rather deplorable what they were putting out. This is not a report that looked at the democratic process of Venezuela. It was just a handful of monitors who had come and then left promptly after the election. And he went on to point out that Venezuelan law requires that election authorities release their full findings days, not hours after the results. And so they're actually putting out this statement prematurely and intervening in a tense situation in Venezuela without giving the Venezuelan government time to, show the world that they just conducted an election under the harsh circumstances that you previously described. So with that, I let you, any final comments going forward here as Venezuela picks up the pieces and presses onward.
Well, I would agree with Vijay's statement. I think that as we think about Venezuela, as I presume that most of the people who are watching us are in the United States, in the global north in general. And as folks like you, who, folks on the left, think and look at what's going on in Venezuela, I think that there's three elements that I would propose that people think about. First is sovereignty versus imperialism. Like if you are for sovereignty, if you think that people have the right to decide for themselves, then you have to be against. You have to not intervene, support the people, but not intervene in the process. Then there's another issue, like if you understand that democracy as we know it around most of the world is very limited, and it's actually a mechanism to reproduce the interests of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalists, as is clearly in the United States, where the two main candidates for the upcoming elections are representatives of the capitalist interests. And if you think that it's worth thinking about another way of organizing a democracy that's not bound, that is not only bound by the vote, by the actual vote, but it amplifies democracy to the assembly, to the direct democracy, then also it's worth looking and supporting the Bolivarian process. And finally, going back to what I was saying in the beginning, the communes. The communes are really extraordinary. They are small. The communes are Chavez's proposal from 2009 to reorganize society, both politically and economically. It's the path and the end goal towards socialism. And this is very important because when people look at the Bolivarian process, even people who are sympathetic with the Bolivarian process, oftentimes forget to look at what is the most, from my perspective, I am biased, I am part of a commune, but from my perspective, the commune is a space that represents actually the possibility of overcoming capitalist social relations. Because in a commune, people have collectively means of production, so the production is not private but social. People collectively decide with what to do with the surplus. People decide how to organize themselves in an assembly context. So in that sense, I think that it's very, very important that if you are wondering, like if you are socialist, like fortunately, so many people who are young in the United States who are socialists, but, like socialism has to be filled with content, and it cannot be just like we are anti-capitalist. You have to fill it with content, and you have to think about a roadmap to getting there. And I'm not saying that Venezuela's roadmap is everybody's roadmap, but it's for sure a roadmap that's worth looking at, because the communes that are emerging in Venezuela are really extraordinary, very incipient. I should add that. Like it's not like the whole country is communalized at all. Formally there's communes around the whole country, but the communes that are really robust are actually just a few, like in the low hundreds perhaps, but they are the space where the new social relations are emerging, and they are emerging democratically, because like one of the things that Chavez does, thinking about real socialism, 20th century socialism, is like him with Mesaros, with the Hungarian philosophy Svan Mesaros, they realize that actually like East Bloc socialism had been wonderful in many ways, but it had had many limitations, and that it had not been democratic enough. And so for the Bolivarian process, socialism and democracy and substantive democracy go hand in hand. And in that substantive democracy, one small part are elections, as we saw them on Sunday, and far more important are the new forms of organizing the society democratically that are emerging. And that's where I place my bets, at least as a common art, and as a person who, like on the one hand, as a journalist who is committed to the grassroots, Venezuelan analysis journalist, but also as a common art who's part of a commune that's trying to build an alternative in the worst of conditions, but it's actually doing it.
I'll say that the communes are inspiring to me as an American, that there is such a limit to the voice that you have in the United States, and so to see something that on a more local sense that you could have an influence in your community is just, it's the kind of thing that I think we should be working toward. But anyways,
I will add one thing. I'm sorry, but I will add one thing. Indeed, communes are local, but they are the strategic project.
well, yeah, yes.
Communes are not just people in a small assembly deciding what to do, but they open the path to the new society. But yeah, we are basically on the same page.
Thank you for that clarification. Now, we'll wrap the interview, but as I always do for my guests, take a moment to let people know how they can support Venezuela analysis if they would like to do so, since that is what you're a part.
Yeah, so go to our website, venezuelanalysis.com, and you'll see a big red button on the top, but also visit our social media. We are very active right now on our social media, and we will be updating you through there. Venezuelan Analysis is a grassroots media. In other words, we of course don't have any corporate support. And it's actually doing all this coverage is actually requires money, it requires funding. So we would encourage everybody who can to support us, to go to our website, especially to learn what's going on here in Venezuela, but also if you think that the work we are doing is good, and if you can, also support us. And also in the Venezuela Analysis page, we do a lot of coverage on communes, which I would encourage everybody to do, because I think there's a lot of learning to do, like revolutionary processes. They have their virtues, they have their limitations, and the extraordinary thing going on here, I would say, is the commune. So I encourage you to go to that, follow our social media, and so on.
All right. Well, thank you, Cira, for joining the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.